The August sun hung merciless over the plains of Apulia in southeastern Italy, and beneath it, 80,000 Roman soldiers were about to march into history's most perfect trap. They didn't know it yet. How could they? They were Rome, masters of the Mediterranean, conquerors of cities, builders of roads that stretched from one horizon to another. They had never lost a war, not really, not in the way that mattered. And on this scourging morning in 216 BC, they were certain that today would be no different. But certainty, as Hannibal Barca understood better than any man alive, is a blade that cuts both ways. The Roman consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro sat astride their horses at the edge of the massive formation, surveying what they believed to be inevitable victory. Behind them stretched the largest army Rome had ever assembled in a single field. Not just large, unprecedented. 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, men drawn from every corner of the Republic and her allied territories. This wasn't just an army, it was a statement. It was Rome saying to the Carthaginian general who had tormented them for 2 years, enough. Hannibal Barca had crossed the Alps with elephants, an achievement so audacious it bordered on madness. He had won at the Trebia River, turning a winter crossing into a bloodbath for Roman legions. He had won at Lake Trasimene, ambushing an entire army in the morning fog and drowning them in shallow waters until the lake itself ran red. Each victory had brought him deeper into Italy, and each victory had made Rome more desperate, more angry, more certain that this foreign invader needed to be crushed with overwhelming force. So they had given up their traditional strategy of caution and maneuver. They had abandoned the guerrilla tactics that might have worn Hannibal down. Instead, they chose the simplest, most Roman solution imaginable: gather more men than the enemy could possibly defeat, march straight at him, and let Roman discipline and Roman steel do what they had always done: win. Varro, the more aggressive of the two consuls, had argued for this approach vehemently in the Senate. "We don't need tricks," he had said. "We don't need to wait him out or starve him or play games in the hills. We need to meet him in open battle with numbers so overwhelming that his clever tactics won't matter. We'll simply roll over him like a wave." And looking at the formation now, it was hard to argue with that logic. The Roman infantry was packed tight, shields nearly touching, spears bristling like the quills of some enormous beast. They had deliberately compressed their lines, making their formation deeper than usual. Where normally they might spread out to match the enemy's frontage, today they had created a massive column of human force designed to punch through whatever stood in front of it with pure momentum and mass. Across the dusty plain, perhaps a mile away, stood Hannibal's army. 40,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, outnumbered 2-to-1 in foot soldiers, though with a cavalry advantage that the Romans had noted but dismissed. After all, this battle would be decided by infantry, as all real battles were. The cavalry would skirmish on the wings, as cavalry always did, but the center, the grinding, blood-soaked center where legionaries met enemy warriors, that's where victories were forged. What the Romans couldn't see, what they couldn't possibly know as they prepared to advance, was that Hannibal had spent the last 2 years studying them. Not just fighting them, studying them. He had watched how Roman armies moved, how Roman commanders thought, how Roman soldiers fought. He understood their strengths, their discipline, their equipment, their absolute unwillingness to retreat once committed. And he understood their weaknesses, their predictability, their reliance on straightforward tactics, their assumption that victory belonged to whoever wanted it most and pushed the hardest. Hannibal had arranged his forces in a formation that would have looked strange to any conventional military mind. His infantry line formed a gentle crescent, bowing outward toward the Romans. At the center of this crescent were his Gallic and Spanish troops, brave, fierce warriors, but lightly armored compared to Roman legionnaires. On either side of the center, anchoring the ends of his line, he had placed his African veterans, his best infantry, men who had fought with him since Spain and through the nightmare of the Alps. These Africans were equipped with armor and weapons stripped from Romans killed in previous battles. They almost looked Roman themselves from a distance. Behind the infantry line, invisible to Roman scouts, Hannibal had given his brother Mago 500 cavalry and 500 infantry with specific instructions that he would reveal when the time came.
The cavalry wings were where Hannibal's real advantage lay. On his left, along the Aufidus River, he had positioned his heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalry under Hasdrubal, not his brother, but another trusted commander who bore the same name. On his right, he placed his Numidian light cavalry, those masters of the harassing attack and the feigned retreat who could ride circles around heavier opponents. As the morning wore on and the heat intensified, Varro gave the order to advance. The Roman war machine began to move, thousands of feet hitting the ground in practiced rhythm, creating a sound like distant thunder that rolled across the plain. The soldiers in the ranks couldn't see the whole picture. They never could. They saw the backs of the men in front of them, felt the pressure of the men behind them, and knew only that they were part of something vast and unstoppable. What they should be asking themselves, if they had the perspective to do so, was a simple question. If we're so unstoppable, why is Hannibal waiting for us in an open field? Hannibal had chosen this ground carefully. The plain at Cannae was large enough for the massive Roman army to deploy, which is exactly what he wanted. Many generals in his position would have sought defensive terrain, would have looked for ways to neutralize Rome's numerical advantage with hills or rivers or forests, but Hannibal wanted the Romans to bring every single man they had into this field. He wanted them confident, he wanted them committed, he wanted them to believe that their numbers guaranteed victory. As the armies closed to within a few hundred yards, the cavalry wings engaged first, as they always did. On the Roman right, their cavalry met Hasdrubal's heavy horse in a brutal close-quarters melee. This wasn't the elegant wheeling and charging of popular imagination. This was ugly, desperate fighting, where horses pressed so close together that riders stabbed at each other with swords, grabbed at shields, wrestled opponents from their saddles. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered and facing veterans who had fought across 2 continents, began to buckle almost immediately. On the Roman left, the Numidian light cavalry engaged in their typical fashion, darting in, throwing javelins, retreating before contact, making the Roman horsemen chase them in frustrating circles. The Romans on this wing found themselves pulled out of position, scattered, unable to form a coherent line, all while accomplishing nothing.
But the real drama, the moment that every soldier on both sides had been anticipating, came when the infantry lines met. The Roman front ranks crashed into Hannibal's crescent formation with tremendous force. The Gauls and Spaniards in Hannibal's center received the blow, and immediately the Romans felt what they had expected to feel. They were pushing the enemy back. The Carthaginian center began to give ground, bending inward under the relentless pressure of Roman numbers and Roman discipline. In the Roman ranks, you could feel the morale surge. This was going exactly as planned. They were heavier, they were deeper, they were better equipped, and now they were winning. The enemy line was breaking. All they had to do was keep pushing. So they pushed. The Roman formation drove deeper into that crescent, which bent and bent and bent, but never quite broke. The Gauls and Spaniards fell back, fighting, yielding ground step by bloody step, and the Romans pressed after them, pouring more men into what was becoming a salient, a bulge in the line where Roman troops were penetrating deep into enemy territory. From his vantage point on a small rise, Hannibal watched this unfold with the calm of a man watching a mechanism perform exactly as designed. His center was doing precisely what he needed it to do: absorb punishment, trade space for time, and, most importantly, draw the Romans in. Every step forward the Romans took was a step deeper into the trap, though they didn't know it yet. The shape of the battlefield was changing. What had started as 2 relatively flat lines facing each other was becoming something else entirely. The Roman formation, in its eagerness to exploit what it saw as success in the center, was narrowing, funneling inward, packing tighter and tighter as more men pressed forward to join what they believed was the breakthrough that would win the battle. And that's when Hannibal's African veterans, standing on both flanks of his formation, who had until now been holding position and watching their Gallic and Spanish comrades absorb the Roman assault, received their signal. They turned inward and attacked the Roman flanks. This is the moment where you need to understand the geometry of what was happening.
The Roman army had formed itself into a massive, deep column, pushing straight ahead. By driving so hard into Hannibal's center, they had created a situation where their own formation was no longer a line, but a thick mass of men, packed shoulder to shoulder, many rows deep, all facing forward. The men on the edges of this mass suddenly found themselves facing a new threat from the sides. Heavily armed, experienced African infantry wheeling into position and hitting them where Roman formations were most vulnerable. Roman legions were designed to fight forward. Their shields protected their front and left side. Their tactics assumed an enemy in front of them. When attacked from the side, especially from both sides simultaneously, the perfect Roman formation became a liability. Men tried to turn to face the new threat, but there was no room to turn. They were packed too tight. The very density that was supposed to be their strength, that massive weight that would crush anything in front of it, had become a cage. Now, add to this picture what was happening with the cavalry. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry had finally broken the Roman right wing completely, routing them from the field. But instead of pursuing the fleeing Romans, which is what cavalry usually did after winning their fight, Hasdrubal wheeled his entire force around the back of the battle. He rode behind Hannibal's infantry line, across the rear of the battlefield, and smashed into the Roman cavalry on the far wing, who were still engaged with the Numidians and now found themselves attacked from behind. This second Roman cavalry wing collapsed even faster than the first. Within minutes, Hannibal had complete cavalry superiority. The Roman horsemen were either dead, fleeing, or about to be. And then Hasdrubal did something that turned this victory into a masterpiece. Instead of chasing the routed cavalry, instead of looking for glory in pursuit, he rallied his men and prepared for the final act of the trap. The Romans in the center were now in a situation that was deteriorating by the second. African infantry pressed them from both sides. The cavalry battle was lost. Their own numbers, which were supposed to guarantee victory, had become their enemy. There were so many Romans packed into such a small space that units couldn't maneuver, couldn't adjust, couldn't even properly fight because they didn't have room to swing their weapons. And they were about to discover that it could get worse. Hasdrubal's cavalry, now reorganized, charged into the rear of the Roman infantry. The trap was complete. The Romans were now surrounded. 80,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded, were caught in a pocket of Hannibal's creation, pressed on all sides, unable to retreat, unable to advance, unable to do anything but die. This is called a double envelopment, and it is the most difficult maneuver to execute in warfare. It requires the enemy to cooperate by committing deeply to an attack. It requires your own forces to hold under tremendous pressure without breaking. It requires cavalry to win their fights quickly enough to help the infantry. It requires perfect timing and coordination across an entire battlefield. It requires, in short, everything to go right. Everything went right. The afternoon became a slaughter. Roman soldiers, some of the best trained infantry in the world, found themselves in a press so tight that when men fell, there was no room for them to hit the ground. They died standing up, held in place by the bodies around them. The dust kicked up by 80,000 men in close combat created a choking cloud that made it hard to see, hard to breathe, hard to tell friend from enemy except by the direction a blade was coming from. Some Roman units tried to fight their way out. They would form a wedge, the tightest formation they could manage, and attempt to punch through the encirclement. A few actually succeeded in breaking through the Carthaginian lines, only to find themselves scattered, disorganized, and hunted down by cavalry in the open plain beyond. Most didn't even try to escape. They fought where they stood because there was nowhere else to go, and they died where they stood for the same reason. The consul Paulus, who had argued against this battle, who had wanted to wait, to use guerrilla tactics to avoid exactly this kind of direct confrontation, died fighting in the press. He refused to flee when there was still a chance, refused to abandon the men he had led into this disaster. They found his body later in a pile of dead legionnaires, identifiable only by his consular insignia. Varro, the other consul, the one who'd pushed for this aggressive strategy, managed to escape with a small group of cavalry. He would live to face the Senate's questions, to endure the whispers, to spend the rest of his life knowing he had led Rome's greatest army to its worst defeat. By sunset, 50,000 Romans were dead. Another 10,000 were captured. The rest had scattered across the Italian countryside, broken, leaderless, traumatized. Hannibal's losses were perhaps 6,000 men, most of them the Gauls and Spaniards who had borne the initial Roman assault in the center. In a single afternoon, Rome had lost almost 100 senators who had volunteered to serve, 29 of the 48 military tribunes, 80 men of senatorial rank, and roughly 1/6 of all Roman citizens of military age. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history, before or since. The news reached Rome like a thunderclap. For days, people couldn't believe it. 80,000 men didn't just vanish. Armies that large didn't lose, not against smaller forces, not in open battle where Roman advantages should have been overwhelming. And yet it had happened. The city went into mourning. Women wailed in the streets. The Senate met in emergency sessions. There was real talk of surrender, of offering Hannibal whatever he wanted if he would just leave Italy. But here's where the story takes its most interesting turn, the part that military academies studied just as closely as the battle itself. Hannibal didn't march on Rome. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, supposedly said to him, "You know how to win a battle, but you don't know how to use your victory. In 5 days, you can be dining on the Capitoline Hill." Hannibal didn't take the advice. Rome, as vast as it was, still had walls, still had reserves, still had allies. Hannibal's army, brilliant in the field, had no siege equipment, no supply base, no reinforcements coming. Taking Rome would require resources he didn't have.
So instead of ending the war in one bold stroke, Hannibal spent the next 13 years in Italy, winning battles, but never quite winning the war, while Rome, resilient, stubborn, refusing to surrender even after Cannae, slowly, painfully rebuilt its strength. The Battle of Cannae became the high watermark of Hannibal's invasion. He never had another opportunity like it. Rome never gave him one. They learned, adapted, changed their tactics. They avoided open battle, harassed his supply lines, attacked his allies, sent armies to Spain to cut off his reinforcements. They turned the war into a grinding attrition that favored the side with more resources, more manpower, more cities to draw on. In 202 BC, 16 years after Cannae, Hannibal was recalled to Africa to defend Carthage itself from a Roman invasion led by a general named Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from them, and turned them against their creator. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal using cavalry superiority and envelopment, lessons learned in blood at Cannae. But the battle itself, that perfect August afternoon in 216 BC, remains one of the most studied military engagements in history. The double envelopment that Hannibal executed so flawlessly has been analyzed, imitated, and attempted by generals for over 2,000 years. The German general Schlieffen based his World War I invasion plan for France on Hannibal's tactics at Cannae. The concept appears in modern military doctrine, in counterinsurgency strategies, in business school case studies about competitive strategy. What makes Cannae so enduring isn't just that Hannibal won against superior numbers. Plenty of battles have been won by smaller forces. What makes it unique is the completeness of the victory. The way Hannibal turned Rome's own strength into weakness, the way he understood not just his enemy's army, but his enemy's mind. The Romans believed that victory came from discipline, equipment, and overwhelming force applied directly. They were right. That formula had won them control of Italy and much of the Mediterranean. But belief in a formula, no matter how successful, creates predictability. And predictability creates vulnerability. Hannibal saw that vulnerability. He understood that an army convinced it was about to win would press harder, commit deeper, ignore warning signs. He understood that soldiers who had trained their entire lives to fight forward would struggle when attacked from the sides and rear. He understood that cavalry, properly used, could be decisive even in an infantry-dominated era.
Most of all, he understood that victory doesn't always go to the strongest or the bravest or the best equipped. Sometimes it goes to whoever sees the battlefield most clearly. The lesson of Cannae isn't just about military tactics. It's about the danger of assumptions, the importance of adaptability, the way strength can become weakness if you rely on it too much. The Romans learned this lesson the hardest way possible, in the blood of 50,000 citizens on a dusty plain in southern Italy. They learned it so well that they never forgot it. Roman military doctrine changed after Cannae. They became more flexible, more cautious, more willing to adapt their tactics to the situation rather than forcing the situation to fit their preferred tactics. In a strange way, the defeat that should have ended Rome made it stronger, more resilient, more worthy of the empire it would eventually build. And Hannibal? History remembers him as one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived, the man who nearly broke Rome, who crossed the Alps with elephants, who won victory after impossible victory. But it also remembers him as the man who won the perfect battle and then couldn't win the war, who understood tactics brilliantly, but perhaps strategy less so, who could see how to destroy an army, but not how to destroy a nation's will to fight. The field at Cannae has been quiet for over 2,000 years now. The Aufidus River still flows where it flowed that day. Farmers work the land. Tourists visit occasionally, trying to imagine the scene, struggling to picture 80,000 men fighting and dying in what is now peaceful countryside. But in military academies around the world, in staff colleges and war rooms and strategy sessions, Cannae lives on. Young officers study maps of the battle, trace the movement of units, argue about whether the Romans could have done anything differently, whether Hannibal's victory was genius or luck, whether the lesson is still relevant in an age of tanks and aircraft and nuclear weapons. The answer, of course, is yes. The specifics change. Cavalry becomes armor, infantry becomes mechanized, the tools and technologies evolve, but the fundamental truth remains. War is ultimately about understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves, about seeing opportunities where others see only obstacles, about having the courage to attempt something unprecedented when conventional wisdom says it can't be done. On August 2, 216 BC, a 33-year-old Carthaginian general who had spent his entire life at war engineered the most perfect tactical victory in military history. He didn't win the war. He didn't save Carthage. In the end, Rome crushed his homeland, razed the city to the ground, and supposedly sowed the earth with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. But on that one afternoon, in that one place, Hannibal Barca showed the world what was possible when genius met opportunity, when preparation met execution, when a single mind imposed its will on chaos and turned the largest army in the Mediterranean world into a monument to its own hubris. The Romans lost 50,000 men at Cannae. What they gained was respect for an enemy they had underestimated, knowledge of their own vulnerabilities, and a burning determination to never, ever let it happen again. Hannibal gave them the worst day in their history. They turned it into a lesson that would help them conquer the world. That's the real story of Cannae, not just the battle, but what it taught, what it cost, and what it meant. Victory and defeat, genius and hubris, the best-laid plans and the fortunes of war, all compressed into one bloody afternoon that still echoes through history, teaching us the same lesson it taught Rome 22 centuries ago. Never be so certain of victory that you forget to question your assumptions. Never be so focused on what's in front of you that you forget to watch your flanks. And never, ever underestimate an enemy who has already proven they can do the impossible.
Up next, if you like content like this, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more.